He wasn't a general, or even an officer. He was a grieving mechanic with a hacksaw, a broken heart, and nothing left to lose. In March 1943, his illegal modification to a single bomber would unleash the most devastating 15-minute. In early 1943, the Pacific War hung in a precarious balance. Japan's military machine still stretched across thousands of miles, from Burma to the Solomons and every island chain between. Their supply lines were strained, their territory vast. Yet they continued to push hard against Allied positions in New Guinea. The campaign there had become a months-long struggle for airfields, jungle ridges, and control of the sea lanes. Whoever held New Guinea controlled the gateway to Australia, and both sides knew it by February. Allied intelligence started intercepting signals, suggesting a major movement from the Japanese base at Rabaul. Reconnaissance flights confirmed the scale: 8 transport ships carrying roughly 6,900 soldiers, escorted by 8 destroyers, all steaming toward La and the northern coast of New Guinea. Their mission was clear. These troops would reinforce the Japanese garrison, stabilize their defensive line, and give them the manpower to launch fresh offensives against Port Moresby. If the convoy reached Lae intact, the Allied foothold in New Guinea would be at risk of collapsing. Stopping it, however, would not be simple. For more than a year, the 5th Air Force had struggled to sink moving ships. Their heavy bombers B-17s and B-24s attacked from high altitude, hoping to hit transports from 10,000 feet. But ships were not stationary targets. A vessel moving at 15 to 20 knots covered hundreds of feet, and the time bombs fell. Even a small course correction meant the difference between a hit and a harmless splash. Reports from previous missions were painfully consistent, bombs landing close but not close enough. Out of every 100 bombs dropped on maneuvering ships, only about 3 found their mark. The Japanese understood this weakness. Their captains had learned to wait until American bombs were. Paul Irving, Pappy, Gunn did not enter World War II as a soldier shaped by strategy, rank, or doctrine. He entered it as a man shaped by work hands-on, relentless, and rooted in the mechanical world of early aviation. Born in 1899 in Arkansas, Gunn enlisted in the U.S. Navy as a young man and served as an aircraft mechanic during the final years of World War I. Aviation was still a dangerous experiment then, a field built on improvisation, problem-solving, and constant repair. Gunn thrived in that environment. He learned to fly, learned to keep failing aircraft alive, and learned how to create solutions when formal instructions didn't exist. After leaving the Navy in 1919, he moved to the Philippines and built anew. Life in a region that depended on aviation far more than the continental United States. Remote islands, jungles, and long stretches of ocean made airplanes essential. Gunn became one of the most respected civilian bush pilots in the Pacific. He flew cargo, mail, and passengers across scattered islands, landing on makeshift runways, and repairing his own aircraft when spare parts were impossible to find. His reputation grew around 2 qualities: absolute competence and an ability to make broken machines work no matter the circumstances. By the late 1930s, he had settled in Manila, raising a family with his wife, Polly, and their 4 children. His flying career provided stability, and the Philippines offered opportunity. For Gunn, it finally felt like the world had calmed. But the calm ended on December 8, 1941. When Japanese forces attacked the Philippines only hours after the strike on Pearl Harbor. As the Japanese advance tightened, Gunn used his flying skills to evacuate American military personnel, intelligence officers, and wounded servicemen out of Manila. The situation deteriorated rapidly. In the chaos, he arranged for his wife and children ages 16, 13, 11, and 8 to board a ship bound for Australia. On December 26th, it was supposed to be the start of their safety. The ship never arrived, not long after it left. Manila, it was intercepted by a Japanese submarine and torpedoed. All aboard were killed. For weeks, Gunn did not know their fate. The confirmation arrived in March 1942, while he was repairing a P-40 fighter nearby. By early 1943, the Allied air campaign in the Southwest Pacific faced a problem that seemed impossible to solve. American bombers' powerful B-17 flying fortresses and long-range B-24 Liberators had been built for high-altitude precision bombing. They were designed to hit factories, airfields, and fixed installations, not fast-moving ships slicing through open water. Yet in New Guinea, they were being asked to do exactly that, from 10,000 feet. The physics alone worked against them. A typical bomb released at that height took roughly 24 seconds to fall. In those 24 seconds, a ship moving at 15 to 20 knots traveled between 700 and 900 feet. A minor change in speed or a last-second turn completely shifted its position. Even the best bombardiers, using Norden bomb sights calibrated for stable, predictable targets, struggled to account for wind, altitude drift, cloud cover, and the ship's evasive maneuvers. A bomb aimed at where a ship was would always fall behind where the ship ended up. The results were consistent and discouraging. After months of missions, the U.S. 5th Air Force calculated that out of every 100 bombs dropped on a maneuvering vessel, only 3 found their mark. A 3% success rate. 97% of bombs simply churned water into towering columns while Japanese transports continued moving, largely unharmed. The numbers were not just poor, they were catastrophic for a theater where every supply ship mattered. Bomber crews understood the problem intimately. Report after report described near misses, evasive action by target, and bombs falling short. Crews spent hours over the ocean, braving anti-aircraft fire, only to watch their payloads splash harmlessly into empty sea. They returned angry, frustrated, and exhausted. Some called it dropping hope into the ocean. General George C. Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, read every report. He knew the vulnerability of Allied positions in New Guinea. If reinforcements from Roybal reached Lié, the Japanese could stabilize their front and potentially threaten Port Moresby. But with bomber accuracy collapsing, he was running out of options. The Navy had no carriers to spare. Submarines were too scattered to intercept every convoy. Air power was the only remaining tool, and it wasn't working. The Japanese, meanwhile, grew increasingly confident. Their destroyer captains learned to wait until American bombs were released, then swing their ships sharply to port or starboard. The tactic exploited the long fall time of high-altitude bombs. Crews viewed Allied efforts as predictable and inefficient. Japanese supply commanders continued sending convoys through contested waters, believing they could outrun or outmaneuver. American bombing runs got the pressure on Kenney intensified. Something had to change. His staff skip bombing offered hope, but when Pappy Gunn watched the first training runs at Port Moresby, he saw a flaw so obvious that no amount of precision flying could fix it. The tactic required aircraft to fly directly at Japanese ships, at altitudes low enough for every anti-aircraft gun on deck to have a clear shot. Pilots had to fly straight, hold their nerve, and release their bombs at exactly the right moment. It was disciplined, technical, and deadly. But as Gunn watched from the shoreline, he realized the real danger wasn't pilot skill, it was exposure. A B-25 Mitchell bomber, even while skip bombing, had only a single .50 caliber machine gun. Its nose. It fired a token stream of bullets, nowhere near enough to suppress the dozens of Japanese gunners waiting on a ship's deck. The pilot flew into a wall of fire with almost nothing to shoot back. The vulnerability was obvious. Without a way to silence those guns, no tactic would save them. Gunn's answer wasn't written in any manual. It wasn't authorized. It wasn't even technically legal. But it was the kind of solution that came naturally to a man who refused. To let rules stand in the way of survival, he went to the salvage yard. Wrecked B-25s lay scattered like broken skeletons across the airfield perimeter aircraft that had ground looped, been hit by enemy fire, or simply worn out in a tropical climate. From these, Gunn collected what he needed: machine gun mounts from fighters, ammunition feed systems, wiring harnesses, and structural elements he could repurpose. Working mostly at night, when engineering officers were less likely to wander, Task Gunn began cutting into the nose of a battered B-25. The plexiglass bombardier's compartment was removed first. He used hand tools, saws, and improvised brackets, shaping the interior into a cavity wide enough to hold new weapon stock. Then came the guns. 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns, salvaged from damaged aircraft, each weighing more than 80 pounds. Gunn aligned them in the forward nose cavity, 2 on each side, slightly staggered and angled to converge their fire at low attack altitudes. Ammunition belts were rigged to feed from boxes mounted behind the firewall. Electrical systems were rewired so a single trigger could fire all guns at once. Every step breached regulations. Every modification could have resulted in immediate grounding, disciplinary action, or even criminal charges. But the work continued anyway. Gunn wasn't driven by authority. He was driven by pilots who needed a fighting chance. When the first test flight came, the impact was unmistakable. A pilot fired the improvised nose guns at a derelict fuel drum placed offshore. The recoil shook the aircraft. The tracers punched a clean line across the water, striking the barrel with overwhelming force. What had been a fragile bomber nose was now a forward-facing weapon. Word spread quickly, and soon rumors of an unauthorized, gun-heavy B-25 reached General George Kenny. Officers expected a reprimand. Instead, Kenny asked one question: does it work? When he heard the answer, he didn't ask for reports, approval forms, or explanations. He simply said, let him finish. In a theater where survival depended on innovation, the rules were quietly rewritten, starting with 1 man and 1 illegally modified bomber. Once the first 4-gun experiment proved viable, Paul Pappy Gunn didn't slow down. If anything, success accelerated him. The Pacific War was unforgiving, and he believed half measures had already cost too many American lives. If 4 guns worked, then 8 would work better. And if 8 worked, then the only logical endpoint was overwhelming firepower enough to tear apart a ship before its gunners could even pull their triggers. The next step meant removing the entire B-25 nose assembly. The plexiglass bombardier's compartment, iconic on the Mitchell bomber, was cut off entirely. In its place, Gunn built a hardened metal frame designed not for visibility, but for stability and fire concentration. Into this cavity, he mounted 8 forward-firing .50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 on each side, arranged to deliver a unified, converging stream of fire at low altitude. These 8 guns alone would have transformed the aircraft into a formidable strike weapon. But Gunn didn't stop there. The B-25's top turret, normally positioned to defend the rear hemisphere, contained 2 additional .50 caliber guns. Gunn rewired the fire control system so the turret guns could be locked forward and fired by the pilot during an attack run. With that, the firepower climbed to 10 forward-firing guns. Still, Gunn believed more was needed. He fabricated blister-style gun pods on each side of the fuselage, 2 on each side, adding 4 more .50 caliber guns to the forward arc. These pods were scavenged from wrecks, improvised from sheet metal, or built in the base machine shop with whatever materials could be found. Ammunition feeds were extended, synchronized, and reinforced. Now the count was 14 forward-firing machine guns. 14 guns controlled by a single pilot. 14 guns that could spit nearly 1,000 rounds per second toward any ship, truck, supply column, or strong point ahead of the aircraft. When the first pilots saw the fully modified B-25, reactions varied from admiration to disbelief. Some ran their hands across the forest of gun barrels jutting from the nose and fuselage, struggling to comprehend how many weapons now faced forward. Others wondered whether the airframe could withstand the recoil without ripping apart mid-flight. A few joked that the aircraft wasn't a bomber anymore, it was a flying chainsaw, built to carve enemy ships in half. But the true test came in combat. In early October 1942. Captain Ed Larner took the first fully armed prototype into action. Against a Japanese destroyer off Buna, He approached low, barely 200 feet over the water, flying straight toward the ship's bow. As the destroyer's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, Larner responded by pressing the trigger. 14 guns erupted at once. The recoil shook the aircraft violently. Tracer lines lashed across the destroyer's deck, shredding gun crews, tearing through superstructures, and igniting ammunition stores. Japanese fire slackened almost immediately as gunners either died or dove for cover beneath the overwhelming storm of .50 caliber fire. With the ship suppressed, Larner released his bombs. One skipped off the water and punched through the hull. Below the waterline, the resulting explosion crippled the destroyer. Within minutes, the vessel was listing, burning, and sinking. The test was undeniable. The flying chainsaw worked out when General George Kenney received the after-action report. He didn't deliberate. He didn't request a committee, design study, or approval process. He issued a single order: build 12 more, immediately. The age of the B. By early 1943, the modified B-25 gunships were no longer experimental projects hidden in the shadows of Port Moresby's maintenance yards. They were now frontline weapons assigned to a mission that would determine the fate of New Guinea. The Japanese convoy 8 transports and 8 destroyers carrying 6,900 troops had been sighted moving steadily toward La. Allied intelligence warned that if those troops landed, the defensive line in New Guinea could collapse. Everything depended on stopping them at sea. The strafers had to be ready, not just technically, but mentally. Skip bombing was unlike anything taught in peacetime. Pilots trained at altitudes so low their propellers kicked ocean spray against the windscreen. They rehearsed maintaining 200 feet of altitude at 250 to 280 miles per hour straight and level, without weaving, without flinching. The instinct in every flyer was to climb when anti-aircraft fire erupted around them, but climb even a little, and the bomb would miss its target. Training focused on precision and discipline. Crews practiced timing skip bomb releases down to fractions of a second. Bomb fuses needed just enough arming distance to detonate on impact, but not so much distance that the bomb sailed under the target. They drilled on recoil management too. 14 forward-firing guns produced immense shaking, enough to nose the aircraft downward if the pilot wasn't prepared. Repeated bursts taught them how to trim the aircraft mid-attack, counter the shutter, and stay on target. Officers continually updated air crews on the convoy's movements. Reconnaissance aircraft tracked the Japanese formation as it zigzagged across the Bismarck Sea, frequently altering course to avoid detection. Weather patterns over the region shifted unpredictably. Cloud banks thickened, tropical squalls rolled across the sea, and wind changes risked altering bombing trajectories. Every update mattered. The mission required absolute situational awareness because once committed to an attack run, there would be no room for improvisation. On March 2nd, Allied B-17s and B-24s attacked from high altitude. Their bombs scored hits but failed to stop the convoy. What mattered most to Gunn's crews was the outcome. A convoy had slowed and changed heading, giving the strafers a predictable attack corridor for the morning of March 3rd. That night, pilots and gunners gathered for a final briefing. Charts were rolled out, course headings were memorized, radio frequencies confirmed. Pilots reviewed their attack formations, 4 flights of 3 B-25s. Space to overwhelm each destroyer and transport in sequence. Maintenance crews worked under lantern light, topping ammunition belts, securing bomb shackles, checking gun mounts, fuel lines, and engines. The gunships needed to be perfect. There was no backup plan. Before dawn, the airfield hummed with quiet urgency. Crews strapped into their aircraft performed final checks and listened as engines coughed to life along the flight line. Thunderous propellers cut through the morning air, echoing across Port Moresby at 10:17 a.m. on March 3, 1943. 12 modified B-25 strafers lifted into the bright Papuan sky, climbing toward the sun. Ahead of them waited the largest Japanese convoy in the Southwest Pacific and the deadliest 15 minutes of naval destruction the war would ever see. The Japanese convoy came into view just after 10:30 a.m. on March 3, 1943. The sea was calm, visibility perfect, and the formation unmistakable: 8 troop transports in 2 columns, screened by 8 destroyers, fanned out to absorb the first blows. Nearly 6,900 soldiers were aboard, standing in formation on deck, preparing for landfall at Lié. None of them knew what was coming. From the south, 12 B-25 strafers approached at wave-top height, the sun at their backs. They flew so low that their propellers cut in vapor trails off the surface of the water. Inside each aircraft were 14 forward-firing .50 caliber guns, nearly 1,000 rounds per second available at the squeeze of a trigger. Captain Ed Larner led the first wave. As he closed to within a mile of the convoy, Japanese lookouts finally spotted the bombers. Klaxons blared across the destroyer decks. Gun crews scrambled to their stations, swinging 25mm cannons and heavy machine guns toward the incoming aircraft. The ocean erupted with tracer fire-red arcs climbing toward the strafers. Larner didn't flinch. He counted the seconds, letting the gunners commit. At roughly 800 yards, he pressed the trigger. 14 guns detonated at once. The recoil slammed through the B-25 like a hammer, the nose dipping before Larner corrected it. A solid wall of tracer fire tore across the destroyer's bow. Superstructures vaporized under the barrage. Gun shields disintegrated. Deck crews vanished in clouds of splintered metal. The ship's forward guns fell silent almost instantly, their crews cut down in the opening seconds. Behind Larner, the other 3 aircraft in his flight opened up. 50 caliber streams converged on the escort screen. The air filled with the roar of engines and the staggering concussion of thousands of rounds hitting steel. The destroyers were blinded, shredded, and disarmed in moments. Once the Japanese guns were suppressed, the skip bombs followed. Larner released 4 500-pound bombs in a perfect sequence. Each skipped off the water like a stone 3 times, striking the hull just below the waterline. The first explosion tore into the engine room. The second ripped open the bow. The third and fourth detonated midship. The destroyer began breaking apart even as Larner pulled up over it. 90 seconds. A frontline warship was sinking. The rest of the first wave struck with similar force. 3 destroyers were disabled or sinking by the time the 4th B-25 broke off its run. A survivor later reported that the attack felt instantaneous, like the sky itself had turned into a machine gun. Then the second wave arrived, and with it, the true killing stroke. These 8 strafers bypassed the crippled destroyers and aimed directly for the transports, the ships carrying the 6,900 soldiers meant for the New Guinea offensive. Transports were slower, far less armed, and packed with troops on open decks. The gunships lined up single file, attack runs spaced just seconds apart. The first transport, Chukose Maru, was hit by 2 B-25s simultaneously. 14 guns from each aircraft fired for 3 full seconds, 5,880 rounds walking the length of the deck. Soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder were cut down where they stood. Others ran for cover that didn't exist. The metal hull sparked and peeled under the relentless fire. Then came the bombs, 8 in total. Each struck low along the waterline. The explosions blew open compartments, ruptured fuel tanks, and set the ship ablaze. Kyokuse Maru rolled to port and vanished beneath the surface in 8 minutes. The second transport met the same fate. So did the third. One by one, each ship was shattered, burning or sinking before the crews could even deploy lifeboats. Soldiers leaped into the ocean, only to land in water thick with oil and fire. Some attempted to swim clear. Many never resurfaced. The final 15 minutes of the battle were a sequence of collapses, transports exploding from internal fires, destroyers running aground after losing power, troop decks being raked again and again as bombers made return passes. At 10:50 a.m., the last functioning Japanese transport took a bomb amidships and capsized within minutes. The convoy was gone. In less time than it takes to prepare a briefing, 14 aircraft had shattered an entire naval reinforcement group. Roughly 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors died, most in the water. Some trapped inside capsizing hulls, others cut down before they ever had a chance to fight. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over. The Japanese Navy had never suffered such concentrated destruction so quickly. And the weapon that made it possible was a bomber rebuilt by a grief-driven mechanic with a hacksaw and an idea. The destruction of the Bismarck Sea convoy rippled across the Pacific with immediate and lasting consequences. In the span of 15 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Army lost nearly half of the 6,900 troops it had intended to land at Leh. Hundreds more died in the hours that followed, drowning in burning fuel slicks or succumbing to wounds before rescue vessels arrived. By nightfall, estimates placed the total dead at approximately 3,000 soldiers and sailors. It was one of the most sudden and concentrated losses Japan had suffered in the entire Pacific War. The reinforcements had been meant to stabilize the new Guinea front and enable a major counteroffensive. Japanese commanders believed they could push Allied forces back toward Port Moresby, regain the initiative, and buy time for additional operations across the region. Instead, the core of their planned assault force lay at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Without those troops, the offensive collapsed before it even began. The convoy's destruction also exposed the vulnerability of Japanese logistics. Up to that point, Japan had relied heavily on fast troop transports and destroyers to move men and supplies between island garrisons. They believed their formations could outrun or outmaneuver Allied air power, especially because high-altitude bombing had proven so ineffective. But the B-25, strafers armed with 14 forward-firing guns and skip bomb capability, had demonstrated a new modeled air attack that Japanese planners had not anticipated. In intelligence summaries following the battle, Japanese officers described the air assault as unanswerable. Destroyers that would normally challenge approaching bombers were silenced within seconds. Transports that should have made landfall were torn open by bombs striking at precise, low angles. The combination of gun suppression and skip bomb accuracy was decisive. From that point forward, Japan avoided sending major reinforcement convoys through the Bismarck Sea or along similar exposed routes. Supply runs shifted to smaller barges, night operations, and fragmented shipments. These methods were slower, riskier, and far less efficient. The loss of the convoy forced Japan into a defensive posture in New Guinea, giving Allied forces the opportunity to advance steadily along the northern coast, taking bases and airfields one by one. For the Allies, the battle marked a turning point. General George Kenny now had proof that low-altitude, gun-heavy aircraft could dismantle entire naval formations. Air tactics across the southwest Pacific shifted almost overnight. Gunn's modified B-25s became the template for future gunships, and their success influenced strike doctrine for the remainder of the war. The victory at the Bismarck Sea wasn't just a tactical win, it reshaped strategy. Japan's ability to move troops by sea was permanently crippled. Allied confidence surged, and the momentum of the New Guinea campaign shifted decisively. One attack had changed the geometry of the Pacific War, and Japan would never again risk a convoy of that scale through contested waters. The impact of Paul Pappy Gunn's innovations did not end with the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. In many ways, that victory marked the beginning of his ideas becoming formal doctrine. Within days of the engagement, General George C. Kenny submitted detailed reports to General Henry Hop Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Kenny described the modified B-25s, their performance, and the results achieved in combat. He emphasized that Gunn's unapproved field modifications had produced the most decisive airstrike against the naval convoy in the Pacific to that point. Arnold's response came swiftly, full approval for every modification Gunn had introduced. What had been unauthorized improvisations now became sanctioned upgrades. The Army Air Forces ordered technical data distributed across all theaters, and aircraft manufacturers were instructed to incorporate these changes into future production models. North American aviation engineers studied Gunn's field-built gunships in detail. They evaluated the nose design ammunition feeds, electrical firing systems, and structural reinforcements. From these assessments came new factory variants of the B-25 models, like the B-25G and B-25H, which included reinforced noses, built-in gun mounts, and, in the case of the B-25G, a 75mm cannon paired with multiple forward-firing machine guns. Gunn's ideas, once considered reckless, now shaped the blueprint for the next generation of attack aircraft. Across the Pacific, pilots quickly embraced the new doctrine. Instead of relying on high-altitude level bombing, crews trained for low-altitude attack runs supported by concentrated forward fire. They learned to synchronize gun bursts with bomb release to suppress enemy gunners in the critical seconds before skip bomb detonation. The results transformed Pacific air warfare. Destroyers, barges, small transports, and coastal installations became vulnerable across previously safe routes. The concept spread even further. Other aircraft platforms were adapted with similar principles: more forward guns, more suppression, more precision at low altitude, A-20 Havocs, P-38 Lightnings, and even C-47 transports received modifications inspired by Gunn's approach. He had proven that firepower, properly concentrated and delivered, could solve problems that traditional doctrine had failed to address. By late 1943, forward-firing gunships were a standard expectation in the Pacific. By 1944, they were a defining feature of Allied strike capability. The innovation rippled outward, influencing designs well into the Cold War era, where dedicated gunships and attack aircraft continued to prioritize frontal firepower and pilot-controlled suppression. What began as an illegal modification in a New Guinea scrapyard had become global doctrine. Gunn's work reshaped the philosophy of air attack, bridging the gap between necessity, improvisation, and official military design. His ideas outlived him, carried forward by every aircraft that used overwhelming forward fire to dominate the battlefield. After the victory at the Bismarck Sea, Pappy Gunn did not slow down. If anything, the success only pushed him to innovate further. The 5th Air Force continued to face deeply entrenched Japanese positions, heavily defended supply convoys, and fortified island strongholds. Gunn responded the same way he always had, by modifying aircraft faster than the enemy could adapt. He turned his attention to the A-20 Havoc, reconfiguring its nose with additional machine guns to create a fast, low-altitude attack platform. He modified P-38 Lightnings with enhanced firepower and extended-range drop tanks built from salvaged drums. He converted C-47 transports into night interdiction aircraft capable of harassing Japanese barges along the New Guinea coastline. Every time a pilot or squadron commander brought him a problem, approached it with the same relentless practicality. If it helped kill the enemy or protect American crews, it was worth doing, regulations or not. Through 1943 and into 1944, Gunn flew combat missions himself, an unusual choice for someone in his technical position. He insisted on testing modifications in real combat conditions, arguing that innovation meant little unless it worked under fire. His reputation grew among air crews who saw him not just as an engineer, but as someone willing to share the risks his ideas created. On October 11th, 1944, during a reconnaissance and strike mission over the Philippines, Gunn's B-25 was intercepted by Japanese Zero fighters near Clarkfield. Despite the aircraft's formidable armament, the Zeros attacked from angles the forward guns couldn't cover. Gunn fought back, reportedly shooting down at least one attacker, but the odds were overwhelming. His aircraft was hit repeatedly, lost control, and crashed into jungle terrain. He was 48 years old. American forces recovered his body 3 weeks later. Gunn received the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously, but official histories mentioned his innovations only briefly. For decades, his name faded behind the broader narrative of the 5th Air Force. The aircraft survived in museums, the tactics survived in training manuals, but the man behind them remained largely unknown outside military aviation circles. Today, Historians and curators have begun restoring his story. Museums display B-25 gunships with plaques explaining the origins of their firepower. Aviation researchers document his role in transforming Pacific air combat. His legacy is clear. One man's grief became a catalyst for innovation that saved thousands of lives. Pappy Gunn may have died in the Philippines, but the doctrine he forged through loss, rage, and relentless ingenuity continues to echo across the history of air warfare.